brought my notes. He's got too many honors for me to remember all of them without notes. I really appreciate being. Is this one on? Okay. Being asked to introduce our speaker today. I've known him for a long time. He was founding editor of the American Voice, one of our good magazines, and he chose one of my poems for publication. So I've known him since 1984. He tells me that it was 1984 that he founded the magazine, but surely it can't be more than 30 years. I'm not old enough for it to be 30 years. But during that 30-plus years, I've met him around the state at various poetry readings and literary events, and found him to be a very good poet and a very good man. He's a very fine and generous person. His greatest honor is being elected or inaugurated last year as Kentucky's Poet Laureate. And just between you and me, I wish he'd been inaugurated as governor. He said at that ceremony that he wants to travel around the state and make poetry relevant to the Kentucky people. And that's what he's doing here today. And this fits right in with our fourth principle. I notice it's on our bulletin. But our fourth principle says the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And that's exactly what poetry does, too. And poetry does it in the best possible words, the fewest possible words. Fred has published scores of poems in our best literary magazines, and he's published 10 books altogether. That's a great number of books for anybody to have published. Some of these are on poetry, and some of them on the art and craft of poetry, and a variety of other subjects, including Thomas Merton. His most recent book of poetry is called Guest House, and he brought, is that among the books you brought? He brought some today for people to, if you'd like to get him to sign a book today, it's in the back room, so don't forget about that at the end of the ceremony. One of the books that will be coming out soon, it's not out yet, I think it's not out yet, on Thomas Merton, the latest one. And I know that you, Thomas Merton fans, will be wanting to watch out for that. You can maybe get it later when it comes out on Amazon. He's been the recipient of a really impressive number of important awards, which I won't go into. That's too long a list, and I know we're eager to get to hear him speak. But I will say that he's professor of English and writer in residence over at Bellarmine College, University now. And he won the Wilson Wyatt Award for excellence in teaching. Actually, that's the most important. I said Poet Laureate was the most important, but to be called excellence in teaching probably is the most important of all. And the last thing is that April is National Poetry Month. So that's why we're especially lucky to be able to have him today. He's been doing poetry readings and talking about poetry all over the state. So it's really good for us that he was able to work us in a very busy schedule. So welcome, Fred.
Thank you, Dot, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, April is National Poetry Month. I learned the other day that it is also National Distracted Driving Month, which does not sound like something we should be celebrating, but there it is. Apparently there is a joke among previous poets laureate that what a poet laureate does is travel around the state explaining what it is that a poet laureate does. We're here really just to advocate for literature and to get people reading poetry, writing poetry, and it's a lot of what I do in the classroom. At Bellarmine, I teach a gen ed course in American poetry. It's the one literature class everybody has to take. So it's American poetry for nursing students. And I treat my nursing students very well, because one day, and they come into my class not liking poetry, and what I get to do is flip it for them. Now, I don't quite understand what has happened, because when we were children, we loved poetry, and we were poets. And the joy at that somehow leaks out. I don't know where it goes or why it does that. But children are natural poets. I remember my older son, when he was maybe 4 or 5, he was out in the yard stabbing things with a stick. Bushes, not the dog, just bushes. And I go outside and I make the dumb father comment, that looks like a cool sword. Looks like a sword, a simile. We know it's a stick, but you're pretending that it's a sword. Well, he stopped what he was doing and looked at me with his gray-green eyes and said, "It is a sword." Metaphor at 4 years old. In his hands, that was not a stick he was pretending was a sword. It was the Excalibur he held in his hand. So children have that gift. When he was in the 4th grade, I went into his classroom to do poetry day. And one of my ideas was I went to the grocery store and bought a sack of fruits and vegetables. And I tried to find the strangest fruits and vegetables I could, like okra, ugly fruit. I bought a coconut, things that I hoped they weren't too familiar with. And each child in the class got to pick one. And I asked them to get to know it a little bit, cut it open, taste it, stick it in their ear, whatever. And then I asked them a series of questions that I wanted them to answer in the voice of the fruit or vegetable they had chosen. Like, who is broccoli's best friend? And you have to use your imagination for that. I still remember the girl who picked the coconut. There wasn't much she could do with it. There were no rocks in the classroom for her to smash it open on. She could feel the hair on the outside. She could shake it and hear the milk on the inside. The last question I asked them was, where do you like to go on vacation? And this girl, 10 years old, writing in the voice of the coconut, said, "I never have to go on vacation because I carry the waves inside me." And every kid in the class did what you just did. They all got it right away. And that's what I think is good poetry, when you feel it immediately and you read it again for the pleasure that it provides. And I tell my students, you may never have heard the two words poetry and pleasure used in the same sentence before, but there it is. One more example of children's creative intelligence. There was a Catholic school putting on their Christmas program. And if you went to Catholic grade school, you know these Christmas programs. And this one, they picked 3 first-grade boys to be the wise men, to bring the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the manger. Now, what does frankincense mean to a 6-year-old boy? He has no idea what that is, and they didn't tell him, apparently. So they get out of order, but that doesn't matter. When it's time, the first boy walks on stage, puts his box down by the manger, and says, "I bring you gold." The second boy walks on stage, puts his box down by the manger, and says, "I bring you myrrh." The third boy walks on stage, puts his box down by the manger, and says, "Frank sent this." Which I think is pretty brilliant, but it's all, I think a lot of it is the matter of how we talk about poetry with our students. In my gen ed class, I tell them, I say, look, the only authority, the only expert on what any of these poems means to you is you. Not me, not the author, not the scholars. Yes, we're all reading the same poem, but we're all different people. And so what I'm interested in is what happens at the intersection of you and that poem. That's what I want to hear about. I think we often ask the wrong questions. I read a story about a woman in Texas, a poet, who for whatever reason decided to take the Texas high school standardized exam. And there was a question in the literature section about one of her poems. And it asked, what was the author's motivation in writing this poem? And she got it wrong. So that tells me that we're not doing something right here. The first day of class, I always ask my students about their experience with poetry. Usually it's been rather unpleasant in high school. I mean, high school teachers, my heart goes out to them, but they're on the front line. They've got so much they have to do. So I feel for them. But I ask my students, how many of you were ever asked to find the hidden meaning of a poem? All hands go up every time. And I get to tell them, I say, I'm sorry, that doesn't exist. There's no such thing. Poems don't come with attics and basements and secret drawers. Where would you hide the meaning of a poem? Furthermore, I think that, let's say that a student read the poem the night before class and maybe didn't understand it, but there was a phrase or an image or something, and they felt something. They had a response. Now, maybe they couldn't even say what that response was, but they felt something. And then they go into class the next day, and the teacher asks them to find the hidden meaning of the poem. Well, that invalidates their aesthetic experience of the night before because it wasn't hidden. And we all know the drill, that the teacher is sitting on a privileged interpretation of that poem, and he or she wants us to guess what it is. Is that fun? No, it's agonizing. And I don't know that it has any educational value whatsoever. The other question that I got in high school was, what's the poet trying to say here? Which always seemed to me like the assumption was the poet tried but failed to say what they wanted to say. And that we, pimply 10th graders in Miss Binkley's third period English class, we're going to fix Emily Dickinson for good. No, we're not. It's just what's there on the page. You just go with it. So I try to be lighthearted about it. I tell them that they are the ones in charge. You tell me about the poem, and we'll start there. What I want to do is try to reintroduce the joy at reading poetry that they used to have as children, because it's there still somewhere. When my sons were little, there was one book, Paddington Bear, that I would read my younger son. And there was a sentence that every time I read it, and I think before he even knew what it meant, he would giggle. He just loved the sound of those words. And I would have to read that sentence 5 or 6 times before I could go on with the story. And the sentence was, I think I can remember it, Mr. Brown finds the bear in Paddington Station in England, and he got there from Peru somehow. That's never explained. Who cares? And he takes him to the cafeteria and sits him down, goes up to the buffet line, comes back with a tray with 2 cups of tea on a plate piled high with sticky cakes. My son just delighted at the sound of that sentence. And so, there's the joy that comes from language. And to try to reinstill that in them is part of my mission, I suppose. I'd like to read a poem. Let me send these around. It's just like class. Let me send these around. Thank you. And to introduce it, soon after the appointment by the governor, and I have to say, out of fairness, the governor came to my induction ceremony in Frankfurt, and no governor had ever been to one before. He made my introduction. He had read my work. He had intelligent and generous things to say about it. So in person, I found him to be warm and engaging, much to my surprise. But he was there. And soon after my appointment, 3 administration guys at Bellarmine showed up in my office. And we were going to inaugurate a new president at Bellarmine, Susan Donovan, in the fall. And they told me that they would like to commission a poem for the inauguration. And my first thought was, oh shit, what have I gotten myself into? I said, guys, okay. And they even had an idea about what it could be about, like how great Bellarmine is. I'm like, guys, no. If something happens, great. If nothing happens, then we don't do it. But something happened, and so this is the poem that I wrote on commission for the inauguration of Bellarmine's new president, It's in 3 very short parts. It's titled Luminary. 1. The moon appears in my window as a beautiful stranger whose mood I cannot guess. She drifts with the night, resplendent in her solitude. 2. How like a beacon is the illuminated window, even mine, I suppose, though I sit alone, reading, expecting no one. 3. The scholar abides in her chamber, reading with delicate eyes and the fingers of a goldsmith. Resplendent in her solitude, she is a light unto the world. So that passed muster. What I've sent around is a poem that I'm not even sure what it's about. I might be the last person to ask that question. What a poet does is write. What a writer does is write. The question of meaning is left to the reader. Randall Jarrell, a poet back in the 1950s, said that a poet is someone who sits down at a desk and hopes to be struck by lightning. And I agree. You write many more poems than you keep. Most of them are no good. You're lucky if some are, and you get to keep them. What you want is to have fine language come to you. What does that mean? I think it means that you read and that you are observant and that you take time to try to write. Or like Bill Stafford, the Oregon poet, who would get up in the morning, his desk was faced into a window, and he wouldn't try to write. He would simply wait for the day to give him something. 2 crows on a tree branch, anything. And then he was off and running, having no idea where it would lead. So this is a poem that is dedicated to Thomas Merton. I think behind it, I can source parts of this poem, like where these images came from, which I won't bore you with now. But I think behind it is Merton's famous epiphany at 4th and Walnut Streets, when he walked out of the Sealback bar and saw the shoppers, and sort of it came over him that all of these people were children of God, and they were all one, and he loved them all. It's just sort of this ecstatic moment. In fact, there's even a plaque at 4th and now Muhammad Ali Boulevards commemorating that epiphany. Beyond that, I don't know what to say about this poem, except that this language came to me, and I wrote it down. There was a good example might be a poem of mine about these 2 bees doing it. I was in DC with some students sitting on a bench, and this bee fell down from the tree into my lap. And I went to brush it off like you do. But I realized it was 2 bees. And they were, this is now the international hand symbol for doing it, I guess. They rolled off my lap into the grass, and I watched. And then when they were done, the female, I guess, flew away kind of woozily, and the male lit up a cigarette. The male flew in a little circle around that spot for a minute. And then, okay, that was it. And later on, I'm back in my hotel room, just writing this down in a journal. And I wrote down what I just told you. And at that point, this sentence just popped into my head. I don't know from where. And the sentence was, "The grass, the air, now sweet with the honey of future days." I don't know where that came from, except I know that I had noticed something. I thought about it. I'd written it down. So I'd done, I guess, the preparation work for that phrase to pop into my head. But it's not a phrase that you could have thought up. You can't left brain your way into that kind of illogical sentence, which, though illogical, makes a certain kind of poetic sense. I think that was the trip. I took honor students to DC for a few years for their senior trip, and I think that was the trip where none of the guys in the cohort could go. They all had conflicts. So it was me and 7 or 8 young women going to DC for the weekend. which was a little weird. The weirdest part, I insisted when I took them that they bring a nice change of clothes and some money, because I wanted to take them out for a nice meal. College students' idea of fine cuisine is like Qdoba, right? So we get dressed up, and I and these 7 or 8 young women go to a nice restaurant, I think in the Reagan building, and we're seated. And as the waiter is handing the menus around, when he gets to me, he leaned down and whispered into my ear, "You must tell me your secret." And I could not say, "Go into education," because that would sound all wrong. So anyway, Bellarmine is all things Merton. He's sort of our patron saint, I guess. The Merton Center is at Bellarmine with all of his papers. Scholars come from around the world to do research there. I had lunch the other day with a guy from San Diego who's writing a novel about Merton. And I'm not going to go into Merton. It's, you know Merton. Although I will say that he almost left the order, left the monastery when he fell in love with a Bellarmine nursing student. And they're attractive. And when I had my hip done a few years ago, I thought surely I'll have some of my Bellarmine nursing students taking care of me. And I didn't. I had an old lady and a guy, and so I was very disappointed. But so anyway, this poem, I guess the Merton Epiphany is behind this poem somehow. Mostly all I know is that this is the language that came to me when I was in that mood, and so I wrote it down. And the question of meaning, I leave entirely to you. So it's in 16 very short parts, so don't blink. Parable of the Stars for Tom Merton. 1. Trees listen with such patience. Maybe you've noticed, out walking in the blue silence of dusk, or along the coast road under stars. 2. The world breathes in salt air and breathes out dust. 3. The base metals do not inspire. A leaden sky offers no epiphanies. The poet, she is an alchemist who turns seawater into gold. 4. To know the mineral worth of things is to see through to milk and bone, to speak beyond truths, to magic a boat in a wash basin, to sail between the twin pillars of Icelandia. 5. And after Vespers, the long walk back to cabins under rain-awakened pines. A girl sings an old air. Open as the sea is her voice to the heavens raised. 6. The evening fires warm the ringing stones and stay the wolves. 7. There comes a light in a corner of the window, the light of a star or a moon, it is difficult to say. 8. It can happen anywhere, of course, an horizon, a holy breathing, an eternity within an instant. It can happen anywhere, on a suburban street, in the Leonin hills around Assisi, on the deep green waters off Marblehead. 9. For example, the old moon rising out of the cornflowers, the blind woman reaching to lift down the pear blossoms, the old man mopping his brow with a hank of grass, the waning light on a waxwing's song. 10. To decant the virtue of the moment is to wash in and out with the tide, to harvest the windfall prayer, to troll your hand in the slipstream over green meadows. 11. We drink the wine of long ago, raise a glass to the tulips sprawling out of their fluted vase on the tasting table. You rub a pensive circle in the burrowed wood. It is the old world asserting itself once more. 12. A poem is a walk in the hills, You skip a few stones across the flat surface of a tarn. The cold water breaks open in little fillips, then closes over again. You move on. 13. Bits of amber await you on the rain-pocked beach. You fill your pockets and arrange the stones on a windowsill, looking out at the stars from whence they came. 14. Our bodies are heavenly, star matter. They feel the shifts in the night. In the half-light of dusk, through the east-facing window, the bright burn of Venus shines above the low arc of earth light. 15. The stars insist on a few cold truths that neither you nor I may ever know. 16. All else is revelation. The sycamores under the melting snow becoming, branch by branch, themselves. Thank you. Some questions? Sure. I'm not sure I'll have the answers, but I'm happy to do that. Yes?
How does one know what a bad poem is?
One knows. One knows. With me it happens pretty quickly or it doesn't happen at all. And if I have to labor over something and it's feeling labored, then I'm like, forget it. It's not, it has, the sweat can't show. And the deeper you get into it, the more you get better at recognizing that. I've had students come to my creative writing class and say, I like to write poetry, but I don't like to read it. And my thought is, what, you're Michael Jordan? You just show up on game day? What's that about? But you pretty quickly get a sense of what's good and not good, and any writer has to become his or her own best editor. So you learn as you go, I think. I do a day of bad poetry in my class. I actually have a book of poems by Danielle Steele that are really bad. And I say, I want to sharpen your discernment. We've been looking at good poems, so let's read some really bad poems. I just read a few. I don't want brain cells to start dying on us here. But they're bad and the students can tell. Yeah. Yes?
I like to write poetry, but every time I go to sit down and write it, it's always rhymes, and it bugs me because I've never written a poem that doesn't rhyme.
Yeah, that's a thing. And what I would recommend is that if the poem is rhyming, and this is end rhyme, I'm guessing, at the ends of the lines, re-break the lines so that the rhymes happen in the middle of the lines.
Okay.
That's actually sonorous to my ear. I don't like reading rhymed poems myself because you're always just da-da-da-da-da-da waiting for that shoe to drop at the end of the line. So just re-break the lines and see if you can do it some other way. One of many tricks of the trade. I could never write rhyming poetry. I'm no good at it. There are people who do, but it's difficult because you have to be so original. And I feel like I have a theory that from the beginning of time in the Western world to about World War I, all poetry rhymed. But since World War I, and then the other cataclysmic events of the 20th century, poetry has mostly not rhymed. And my theory is that it doesn't rhyme because life doesn't rhyme anymore. It would sound incredibly naive these days to write rhyming poetry. So it's another good reason, I think, to get away from that. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is a question or an observation, but I teach with somebody who brings in a lot of poetry, and it seems like one of the challenges of reading poetry is that some poems you can just kind of pick it up and read it, maybe because you already share enough of the world with that poem and habits, but there are certain kinds of poems where you can read it and you don't have kind of a backstory. This is somebody writing in the voice of
Well, there are poets that I don't teach. I don't teach T.S. Eliot. I just find him dense and not worth all the footnotes. I like accessible 20th century American poetry that you get on first reading. And I like having fun with it. There's a poem by E.E. Cummings called She Being Brand New, which is a poem at once about two things: learning how to drive a stick shift and losing one's virginity. And I skew it toward the car. You know, we talk about cars for like 20 minutes, and I tell them it's about learning how to drive a stick shift. And I do it so that they can be surprised on their own to figure out, oh, this other thing. And I'll read it. Now I've got it pretty much memorized. I'll recite the poem. And as I'm reciting it, I'm looking around the room to see who's getting a little grin on their face. And this poem has never failed me. There's always one. And I can pull it out and I say, Helen, what are you grinning about? And she's like, no, I can't say, you know. It's okay, it's all, what happens in English 200 stays in English 200. And then she comes out with it, and they crack up. And we read it again. And they're getting all of the double entendres. But I like leading them to the water and not just going in and lecturing about, you know, this is what this is, and these are all the devices, et cetera. So I try to have fun with it myself. You know, I like to be entertained as well as they do. But yeah, there are a lot of poets that I just don't go near because it's opaque. And I want it, you know, these are people who don't read poetry. So I want them to have a pleasant experience. That might sound lightweight, but I want to turn them into not many English majors because they're not. I want to turn them into readers. So I want to give them a pleasurable experience. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I missed the question because I stepped out of it, so maybe you might ask again. One was already been asked. And you talked at first about how personal poetry is to the reader,
Mm-hmm.
and the reader looks for the meaning in it to them. And yet, there are people who would read Danielle Steele, and it could speak to them, and so for them it would be good.
Well, I don't know, maybe. I mean, we go to poetry not to learn about the author, but to learn about ourselves. And I just don't think those poems, like bad poems, I just don't think they give you anything. It's just the speaker being angsty about love, and that's all there is. So I would guess not, but I don't know. I can't speak for them. I mean, every book that Danielle Steele has ever written has been on the New York Times bestseller list. And they're all lousy. And the only reason I can come up for it is that most people have no taste. That's all I got. I have a friend who once wrote an essay. She was at a friend's house, and us English types, like if we go to your house, we'll notice the books on your shelves and form an opinion of you based on those books, which is probably not fair. But she noticed Danielle Steele books on the shelves and made a face. And the hostess said, well, what's up with that? What do you think is good writing? And she took the question seriously and wrote an essay in which she compared passages on similar subjects from a Danielle Steele book and a novel by Toni Morrison, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1990s. And when you see it head to head, you really see the difference, why Toni Morrison is good and Danielle Steele is not. So, yeah, that's all I can say on that. Yeah. Yes.
I've been thinking and reading a lot about creativity,
Mm-hmm.
and can you speak to how you encourage your own writing, or I mean, do you try to put yourself in a place or a mood, or can you even do it at all? Is it just a surprise?
It's often a surprise, but I tell my students that they should do the things that will allow them to be creative. For example, find a space where you can be alone and uninterrupted. And if you have a roommate, make them go away for a while, or you go away for a while. My friend Sally Bingham, a writer, said that a writer has to develop what she called a divine selfishness. You need time, you need space, you need the right music, you need the right pen, you need the right paper. These are all the little conditions that you can make for yourself that will encourage that activity. It doesn't guarantee that anything's going to happen. I wrote an entire book of poems in response to reading a book by a Norwegian poet, Olaf Hodge. And I don't think you could look at the two books and see an influence, but clearly I was responding to what he had written. So all art, I think, is a conversation with the past. So you need to be conversant with the past. You need to read and look at paintings and listen to music, and then have the leisure to just kind of sit and stare into space until something happens or doesn't happen. And if nothing happens, get up and go for a walk, do something different. I don't think there are any documentaries made about a poet's life, because all they do is just sit and stare into space. Not a lot of activity there. So if you can create the conditions, then you're one step closer. And the rest of it is luck, the universe, who knows. Kara?
I'm not sure exactly where this question's coming from, but
Okay.
I guess because we're in a spiritual space,
Okay.
how would you connect poetry to spirituality in your mind?
I think they're very close, actually. And I'll go to Merton on this. Late in Merton's life, he wrote in his journal that he wished, most people read Merton for those essays about meditation, prayer, peacemaking, etc., the sort of sermonizing essays. And that's his word, not mine. But late in his life, he wrote in his journal that he wished he'd written fewer of those pious essays and more poetry and prayers. So that tells me that in Merton's mind, poetry and prayer are connected. They're the two supreme art forms in his mind, and that they share a great deal. When I get a poem, the feeling is one of kind of unity with the universe. I feel like this is where I am, and this is where I should be. I don't know that I would say that it's spiritual, but someone else might, and I would be okay with that. With poetry and prayer, you're tapping into an essential part of the human psyche that is, to some degree, beyond words, and yet dealing in words to get there. One example. There are some, I've read, people who belong to a Catholic congregation who switched from Mass in Latin to Mass in English. And when they heard the Mass in English, it was no longer a spiritual experience because they understood all the words. And they switched back to Latin, a language they don't know. And once again, it became a spiritual experience. So you're using words to get beyond words. There's what we can say, and there's so much that we can't say. And I think poetry narrows that gap a little bit. So yes, I think we're dealing in the realms of the extraordinary to a degree. Yeah. I would use the word extraordinary, yeah. Okay. Thank you. My pleasure. Yes, sir.
To what extent is the Gettysburg Address a poem? And if we can see the poetry, to what extent can we use poetry to refine how we write or present ideas?
I would agree that the Gettysburg Address is a poem, a prose poem. It's certainly elevated language, and it calls us to higher thought. I was in Glasgow, Kentucky a few weeks ago with the U.S. Poet Laureate, a young African-American woman named Tracy Smith who teaches at Princeton. And her thing is to go to rural parts of America that she feels have been culturally underserved. So she went to a Native American reservation. She went to Sam Clyburn's congressional district in South Carolina. She found a place in Glasgow called the South Central Kentucky Cultural Center. And we went down there and did a program together. And 200 people showed up. And it was amazing. And she's an amazing person. And she was telling me, to your point, she read that night a poem in her new book, which I just got. And what she did was she took a rough draft of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, especially the part talking about how the British had oppressed us, the colonies. And she started making erasures in the text. And what she wound up with was an amazing poem about the Black American experience. Like, where did that come from? So poetry leads us in places that we did not know we were going and did not know existed. And I think dealing in refined language of that sort calls us to our highest thoughts. And this is certainly a time when we could use that. Yeah. Good question, though. I don't think I have the answer for it. But thank you. Thank you.
That's a good addition.